Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I've been told to not run over, so I'll try not to do that. I was just looking around the room to see if there's any people here of similar vintage to myself, and I was a bit worried there might not be, and I can see that there aren't. So if I stand out of the way, it might help. Have I gone the wrong way? It's great, isn't it, with technology? We always get it wrong. It's broken. Right, so you'll remember the Cybermen. What? That's not the isn't it? Is that not the Cybermen? Is that not the Okay, here's the Cybermen. I don't know about you. I'm really scared by them, the Cybermen. But here's a real Cyberman. Anybody know who this is? I can't remember his name. He's a Turkish fella who nicked about $55 million, mainly through bank fraud. But quite successful, got a very attractive young wife and a family, and they didn't know what is going on now. There he is, looking a little bit more sinister. The only wheel he's sitting behind now is the sort that you run round to make things work inside a prison. But he got 14 years for nicking about 55 million quid, and he's a real Cyberman. And the British Computer Society describes cyberspace as a virtual world or something like that, doesn't it? Virtual. It's not virtual, it's real. It's actually there, isn't it? The internet and all the stuff connected to it is real. He's real. They're real, aren't they? They're definitely real. Anyway, so what I want to talk to you about today is things more of a governance nature. There's a clue in the name of our business, IT governance. That's what we specialise in. And actually, you can have all of the controls and technical solutions in the world, but how do you know whether you've got the right ones? How do you know whether you need them all? If you bought everything that was ever offered to you, you'd bust the budget every year. So we're going to talk briefly about, from a cybersecurity perspective, the impact of GDPR. Yes, everybody knows about it. If you're running a business, if you're a person living in this country, you cannot fail to know about the British Airways breach recently. It was both a PCI DSS breach and a GDPR breach, a privacy breach, but it was a breach of their networks, essentially. And if you're a British Airways, any British Airways shareholders in the room? Okay, so nobody here is going to know how much it actually costs them in the end. We reckon it's going to cost them about £1 billion, pounds. But you know, the shareholders will probably get to know, maybe the public will get to know, but we won't know that for quite a long time. It's going to be very, very expensive for them. But we're going to talk about why GDPR is relevant in the context of cybersecurity, because we're talking about the future of cybersecurity today. Privacy is, of course, a driver for cybersecurity. Why bother to keep your information secure if you haven't got any reason to do it? And privacy is a big reason to do that. And just talk about some practical steps from a governance perspective, because you've heard already and will hear again about technical solutions and things like that you can do. And I'm sure everybody's very well versed in a lot of those things. Cybersecurity is about protecting data, of course. It's protecting the things that support and give you the data, give you access to it and be able to use it and run organisations. And data protection is also about protection of data, so they kind of fit together quite well. So the relevance of GDPR to cybersecurity is undeniable, really. Also, we need to think about other frameworks. Cyber Essentials, it's not a law, it's a thing that you can use to provide assurance. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. It's fairly basic level of security. The Network and Information Systems Directive, or rather regulations now, requires lots of organisations, maybe some of them are represented here today, to do things, and they use the word appropriate a lot in that law, appropriateness. And in GDPR, you'll find the word appropriate used a lot as well. What does appropriate mean? That's very important from a governance perspective. If you're in the NHS or in the NHS supply sector, you've got the data security programme. Again, that's not law, that's a contractual obligation. If you want to do business with the NHS, you have to meet those requirements. And all these things are about information security. Now, GDPR requires some specific things. We'll all be familiar with confidentiality, integrity and availability. I've heard it a million times. Those are the elements of information and cyber security. There are specific requirements within the NHS to do things like pseudonymisation, encryption, protecting the CIA, doing the testing, the evaluation, all of those good things. And of course, governance is about being able to account for what you did or didn't do. If you do nothing, and you never get a breach and nothing ever goes wrong, Great, that's fine, that's lovely. But of course, the chance of something going wrong in today's world is going up all the time. It's going up exponentially every day, every second really. So not doing anything clearly isn't an option. It is for a few people, maybe a sheep farmer in the Hebrides or somebody doesn't need to worry too much about it. But for most of us running businesses of any sort or any organisation, obviously we do, because we need to account for whether or not we did those things. A specific requirement, when the measures don't work, and all of the solutions that anybody can ever think of are not 100% guaranteed to work. They should work most of the time, but there's no guarantee that they will. And when those measures don't work, when a breach happens, then there is an obligation to report. Okay? So I'm sure many people know about this. Has that got a thing on it? Yeah. Okay, so both the processor, if there is one, and the controller has got to do some reporting, got to do some notification. You've got to own up to what you did. It's a little bit like if you're running a public company and you're not going to make as much profit as you said you were going to make, you've got to make a report. Things like that. So you've got to own up to it. It's about accountability. And if you don't, if you fail because you didn't have a process in place and that you know how to report, you're in trouble. If you miss the 72-hour reporting deadline to report to the ICO, you're in trouble. You're going to get punished. You're going to get punished anyway, probably, but the degree of punishment, the severity, is going to be much greater if you fail to report, for example. And that's a process. It's not a technology solution. It's a process that organisations need to have for the eventuality that a breach occurs. And of course, we wouldn't have thought that BA would have got breached, at least not so soon after the big day of 25th of May. But this is what's going on. Look, the ICO, this is publicly available information. They're telling us that, we've got now, what is it, about 1,700 or so reported breaches in June. And before that, because there was no legal requirement to do so, people weren't reporting, but now they are. And I've heard some other stats today, but what they're saying is that, sorry, I'll turn this way around, it's better. What they're saying is that about 20% of the reported breaches are to do with cybersecurity. They're not all cybersecurity, but 20%, a fifth are, and about 50% of those are phishing. Phishing, there's a lot of human factors in that, isn't there? I mean, it's mainly actually about human factors, or significantly about that. So about 400 I thought I put the number on there, I must have failed to do so, but that works out about 400 or so phishing-related breaches in June alone, and those are only the ones that were reported. Those are only the ones that were reported of the ones that actually took place. One day an investigation could take place in organisations that didn't report something because they didn't even know, and it's discovered that there was a breach, they failed to report it. So that's breaking the law, and there are going to be consequences, clearly. But this is what's going on. So people are scared because they're starting to report things. Okay, so from an accountability point of view, this is what the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, has to say about it. Okay? Organisations have got to understand the risks. You can only understand the risks if you do some kind of risk assessment process. You can't just think, oh, well, you know, it's not too risky, I'll just leave it. You've got to actually have a process and be able to show what you did to understand the risks. You've got to mitigate the risks. You can't say, yes, I know the risks are bad, but hopefully nothing will happen. You've got to do something. You've got to show that you're doing something to mitigate those risks. It's not just box ticking. You've got to have a framework. The ICO expects a framework, and anybody who doesn't have some kind of management framework, some kind of set of processes, is going to find it very difficult when it comes to accounting for what you did or didn't do in the event of a breach, which is increasingly likely, of course. Proportionate governance measures. Comprehensive and proportionate. What does that mean? You've got to interpret what all those things mean. This is a very big governance job. Ultimately, we're going to need clever technical people to help us to manage the risks, but initially we've got to understand what the risks are, and we've got to kind of work out which are the biggest and the not so big, and deal with them proportionately and appropriately. And there's got to be change to the culture of the organisation. Everybody in the organisation has got to be aware of their role in protecting data, not just personal data, but all sorts of data. Personal data, yes, from a GDPR perspective, but actually all sorts of data, because all data should be of value to the organisation. And so everybody's got to be aware of their role, the importance of it, and what they can do, what they can't do, how they can contribute to that. And organisations that can't show that they've got this culture are going to find it more difficult when the time comes to account for that, when there's a breach. I just threw this in because, just in case there's anybody, there will be people who disagree with me that cybersecurity is part of information security, but I took this out of ISO 27002. ISO is a reasonably credible organisation. And just so I didn't breach any copyright laws, I made that one myself. That's an artist's impression of the diagram within ISO 27002. I had good fun doing that on the train this morning. But it's broadly about these things. Cybersecurity is at the centre of information security. And then slightly outside that, we've got the issue of critical information infrastructure, be that internal to the organisation or public infrastructure as well. So that's just a conceptual thing, just to position where cybersecurity is. It's all about information and data, whether we're talking cyber, networks, applications. It's all data that we're trying to protect, because that's the most valuable thing. Now, I've talked about accountability a few times. How do you account for what you did or didn't do? Well, if nothing goes wrong, you're probably not going to be asked to account for it. So that's good. But the number of organisations for whom nothing ever goes wrong is getting incredibly small now. And knowing, from the point of view of a director of a company, there is an obligation on all company directors to promote the success of the organisation and to take reasonable steps. And if you haven't taken the reasonable step of knowing how you would deal with risks, then you've probably failed in your duty as a director. Okay, somebody's got to find you out and they've got to take you to task over it. That may or may not happen. But I just want to talk about certification, and IT Governance is known as a company that deals with certification, because certification is a recognised way of providing stronger levels of assurance. If you just say to somebody, look, don't worry, we've got everything sorted, okay, that's reasonably good assurance, but can you be trusted? Well, if you said that to somebody else and actually something went wrong, then not really. But if you've got somebody else, a third party, to come along and say, yeah, these people actually have got it sorted, that's really the role of certification. It's just a level of assurance which people need. Some organisations won't do business with you if you haven't got some kind of certification. And there are various forms of certification or attested compliance or conformity available, and certification clearly is one of those things. So, assurance for directors and stakeholders. As I mentioned, directors have got a duty to know about their risks and to make sure that they're appropriately managed. But what about stakeholders? Customers, clients, employees? There's a duty to all of these people to make sure that all of these risks are being appropriately managed. And how do you provide that assurance? Well, you can either just sort of hope nothing goes wrong, but not everybody is assured by that. But if you provide proactively some evidence that you've done something about it, then there's a good chance that they'll believe you. So with no kind of auditing of any sort, just putting some things in place and then saying, there, we've done that now, let's hope everything will be fine. Okay? Well, very little assurance, because, yeah, you've done it, the world changes, the risks change, the systems change, the configurations change, and things that worked last week don't work anymore, and all that sort of stuff. And so there's very little, oh, keep pressing the wrong button, sorry about that. Very little assurance that, that things are going to remain secure. Okay? Let's put in some controls. And most organisations, the vast majority of organisations that we come across, we work with hundreds of clients a year, and they usually say to us, yeah, we've got pretty much, we're there. And often they've got quite a good set of controls. There's lots of gaps in the controls, but the selection of controls isn't based on anything other than it's available, I've heard about it, I had it in my last company, somebody offered me a good deal, it came with the system out of the box. Those are the main reasons why people choose controls. And it's obvious, isn't it? Everybody's got it. And yeah, that's true for a number of controls. But other than that, the selection of controls is usually not based on anything at all. And to base controls on things like what the risks are is actually seen as really the most obvious way of protecting data. And that's one of the themes that the ICO is talking about and is promoting. And the concept of risk, of course, is enshrined in the GDPR. So if you have something like an information security management system, and many of you, probably all of you, know very well what one of those is, you've got a set of management processes. Those things are the most likely to ensure that data and information is protected and continues to be protected, and that the way they're protected is based on risk. So information that, for example, publicly available information such as a public price list, don't secure that so that nobody can see it, because you actually want them to see it. What you don't want them to do is to change it, but you do want them to see it, for example. So base everything on risk. From a GDPR point of view, there's something called a personal information management system, which does a similar job in terms of the assuring the rights and freedoms of individuals. But we're not here to talk about privacy so much today as cybersecurity. But it's a complementary management system that, if joined together with an ISMS, provides a really good level of compliance assurance for GDPR. Of course, certification, I'm expounding it really, it's an optimal solution. because the comprehensiveness that's built into an ISMS, as long as the ISMS is based on a recognised framework, as opposed to what the bloke down the pub suggested, or somebody who worked here 25 years ago suggested. If it's based on a recognised framework, then that's probably the strongest form of assurance. And if you get a third-party attestation to that, it can't get much better, really. The only thing that can get better than that is, I don't know, some kind of crystal ball that proves that nobody can ever get in, because no network, no environment can be guaranteed to be 100% secure. So what do you need to do to be compliant with GDPR? Well, there's all sorts of processes to do with protecting the rights and freedoms of individuals. People know about things like subject access requests. That's the most commonly trotted out expression. But that's a privacy management process that we're not here to talk about. We're here to talk about the protection of data, really. So here are some steps which make a lot of sense. You've got to have an accountability and governance framework with roles and responsibilities. People whose job it is, and they know it's their job, to make sure that the data is identified, the risks are identified, and people are given responsibility and authority to manage those risks. Because if you haven't got that, it's very likely that the risks will go unmanaged, and gradually things will change, system states will change, configurations will change, threats will change, and one day a breach will occur. So making sure that people know it's their job and they're doing it on a regular basis, not just once. Identifying the information. We call it a data flow audit. Identifying the sensitive, valuable assets, the data. That's the most important stuff. Because if we know what we've got, then at least we can identify the risks and manage those risks. If we don't know what we've got, we really can't do that. So that's very important. Obviously, I've talked about identifying risks. Once we've identified the risks and worked them out, then we can begin to identify the appropriate technical and organisational measures. Technical security solutions, management processes, things that reduce the risk of a breach taking place and the impact should it occur. Having the operational policies, procedures, processes, all of those things that in organisations we know that we need to have in order to do things the right way every time. Virtually all of us have to rely on written procedures, notebooks, diaries, things to remind us how to do things. We can't commit everything to memory. And for something like this, because it's not done every day, we have to have this set of collateral in order to make sure that things are done properly. Monitoring and auditing, very important. With networks and systems and applications, we can do automated monitoring, of course, and that's very useful because it's very cost effective and it can usually check 100% of everything that ever happens. That's very useful. But there's lots of other things that need to be monitored and checked by people, such as the behaviour of people, or maybe sometimes system states and things like that that can't necessarily be monitored automatically. Obviously, where automated monitoring can be done, it's usually good value, not always, but usually. But it often requires people to do monitoring as well. Oh, okay, I need somebody to monitor my use of this thing. And auditing whether the processes are actually working themselves. If we're going to do a risk assessment process, we can't just do it and assume that it's worked correctly. We need to monitor it, we need to audit it to make sure it actually does produce the desired results. Otherwise, we can be kidding ourselves that the risks are all okay when they might not be. Telling people about what's going on. Communications, an obvious part of what we need to do. And when it comes to accountability, if you've already told somebody that you might have a problem, then the negative impact of something going wrong, should it go wrong, is always likely to be less than if you'd never told anybody about it. And a continual improvement process. This is central to a management system. Those who are familiar with ISO management systems will know this well. A continual improvement process, because no process, no set of processes, no framework is ever going to be perfect. It can always be improved. It can always be made better. You should be trying to get the best levels of security for the least amount of investment all the time. And continual improvement can help to do that. Significantly, it should help to continually reduce the risks. Okay, yeah, thank you. We need to check whether it's working. Here's some key points. Okay, so GDPR specifically includes cybersecurity obligations. Okay, they have to be done. So you need to find out what they are and do something about it. It's a subset of information security. I would say the objective is to have an optimized set of optimized security controls. Only the right controls that you need, working well all the time, and knowing that they work well. That should be the objective. So monitoring and different sorts can help with that. Optimal control sets, already talked about that. And how do you do that? Okay. a set of management processes, a management system is what I'm proposing to you as the way to do that. There are various standards associated with this. ISO 27001, most people know that quite well. It's a management system for which there is a third-party attestation process known as accredited certification, which is good assurance, as I said at the beginning. There are other standards, and if you base what you're doing on other standards, other frameworks, codes of practice, guides and things which are internationally recognised, such as some of these here, then that's pretty good. That's probably as good as you can get. There are other forms of regulation to take into account when protecting data as well. I've already mentioned the NIST regulations. There's the Companies Act. Somebody here will know, I think it's something like Article 176 or something of the Companies Act, the duty to promote the success of the company. And that requires appropriate decisions to be made in respect of everything, not just financial management. And that actually means doing the right thing as far as data security is concerned. The Financial Services Act, regulated firms, they have to look after other people's money, and so there are laws that say you've got to manage the risks appropriately so that you don't lose people money. Okay, so I've run out of time. We call ourselves a one-stop shop. We've got a bit of misalignment here. So there's some various things here that we can help with. People can come to us for a little pocket guide for £15 or something, or buy a copy of the standard, or they can come to us for some consultancy or some training, or some software to help with risk management and data flow mapping, all sorts of things they can come to us for. To find out more, a lot of you have done it already, I know, visit Stand 11, which is conveniently outside there. And apparently we've got a prize draw, which already a lot of people have entered, to get 25% off a DIY 27001 implementation package. Got to be worth writing your name on a piece of paper for that, I would have thought, because that's worth several £100. Okay, thank you very much.
Tony, thank you very much indeed. You all know about GDPR now. I pick up on the British Airways thing. I booked a second honeymoon to Hong Kong in the period that they were attacked, and I went online to change my seats. And I got a letter from BA saying, we've been hacked. You may have lost all your details, your credit card, the security code. We will assure you that Experian, the credit reference agency, will be told about this in your name in case anybody starts frauding you. So they took it very, very seriously. And I would suggest the $2 billion that Tony mentioned is the tip of an iceberg. So without further ado, let's move on with the programme.